Good evening, dear colleagues, dear workshop participants, dear friends, and dear guests. This is the last program of the today workshop, a roundtable discussion about the legacy or legacies of Simon Wiesenthal. And I just wanted to say welcome, because now Alexia WEISS will introduce the guests and she will moderate the discussion. So enjoy this evening.
Thank you very much. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to this roundtable discussion as part of the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute's workshop today and tomorrow on Nazis and Nazi sympathizers in South America after 1945. This evening we will be discussing the legacies of Simon Wiesenthal. I would like to welcome Brigitte BAILER, here to my right, from the Documentation Center of Austrian Resistance. It's the DÖF, you know it all. Shimon, also to my right, from the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Paris, and Efraim ZUROFF from the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Jerusalem. Brigitte BAILER is a historian and was deeply involved in the creation of the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute. This is an academic institution. Shimon and Efraim ZUROFF work more in the field, as Mr. Samuels put it in a preliminary talk for this event. The aim is to follow up on information about former Nazis and perhaps track down some of them. In the first round, I would now like to ask all three of you to introduce your institution and the work that is done there. And that I would like to start with you, Efraim. May I ask you to present the founding history and the work of the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Jerusalem today?
Okay, so the Simon Wiesenthal Center itself, I have to tell you, was created and opened in 1977. And the person who deserves the credit for that is Rabbi Marvin Heyer, who was a rabbi. He born in New York to immigrant parents, was a rabbi in Vancouver for 20 years, and he realized that there was a very important possibility to build an important Jewish organization in Los Angeles. In other words, Los Angeles already had more than 500,000 Jews. There was not a single national Jewish organization in Los Angeles, and he thought that it would be important, and there was an opportunity there. Now, our office, is the office in Jerusalem, was only open in 1986. Although I had been the academic director, the first academic director of the Simon Wiesenthal Center from 78 to 80. But the reason I came to America was not for that. It was actually to collect material for my PhD, which is on a different subject. And then I worked for 6 years in Israel as a researcher for the United States Office of Special Investigations, which was the agency which prosecutes the Nazis who were discovered living in the United States. And in the course of my work there, I discovered a way that I could identify the immigration destinations of thousands of Nazi war criminals who would go into the Anglo-Saxon democracies. And at that point in time, the only Anglo-Saxon democracy that had decided to take legal action against the Nazis was the United States. I was working for them. Canada and Australia were investigating. UK and New Zealand made believe, they ostensibly didn't know that they had a problem. Let's put it that way, ostensibly. Okay, so I realized that that I could make a much more serious contribution by leaving the U.S. Justice Department, and they hired someone after me who worked there for another 17 years. But the aim was to start flooding these countries with the names of as many suspects as we could find in order to convince them that they could not just walk away from the problem and not take legal action against the Nazis in Canada, Australia, UK, and New Zealand. The good news is that Canada in 1987 passed a law enabling prosecution. Australia in 1989 Great Britain in 1991, and the only country that did not pass a law of that sort was New Zealand. But our office became the center for the efforts to facilitate the prosecution of Nazi war criminals, and we did so all over the world. And believe it or not, we continue to do so because there still are Nazi war crimes trials. There are two actually at the moment in Germany, one of the Secretary of the Commandant of Stutthof, another one of the SS Guard in Sachsenhausen, and we assist the prosecution by finding potential witnesses to survivors who can testify. But another thing is that in German law, there's a thing called Nebenklage, which is someone who lost a first-degree relative in the camp at the time that the defendant was serving in that camp. So it has to be either a parent, a spouse, a child, or a sibling. And then they can join the prosecution, they can speak in court, they can ask questions, and it's a thing with tremendous closure for the relatives. So we also do that. But as you can all imagine, time is running out on the efforts to prosecute. We're reaching the end, and most of our efforts today are directed at combating the horrible Holocaust distortion in Eastern Europe. In other words, all the post-communist countries have a serious problem of Holocaust distortion. In other words, they do not, I want to make this clear, they do not deny that the Holocaust took place. It's not Holocaust denial. They have simply changed the narrative of the Holocaust for 4 reasons. One is that you have to understand that only in Eastern Europe did collaboration with the Nazis include participation in systematic mass murder. In other places, Holland, Italy, Greece, Belgium, the collaboration ended at the train station or at the port. The Nazis didn't expect their collaborators in those countries to carry out the murders themselves, and they didn't want them to carry out there. They sent the Jews somewhere else to be murdered by someone else. That somewhere else was Eastern Europe. Someone else was the Nazis, the Einsatzgruppen, death camps, and of course the local collaborators, without whom the Holocaust never would have reached the scope that it did. Now, they, and after World War II, they were not liberated and became liberal democracies. So they were either under part of the Soviet Union, in other words, the 5 Soviet republics, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, or countries like Czech Republic, Romania, Yugoslavia, Poland, what am I missing? 1 or 2 others, okay? And it was the communists who decided what would be said about the Holocaust, what would be taught, what was the narrative. They refused, for example, to acknowledge that the fate of the Jews was unique among the enemies of the Reich. They didn't want to distinguish between the victims, and so it was only in 1990, when the Soviet Union crumbled, that these countries had the first opportunity to learn the truth, to write the truth, to teach the truth, to write the truth, and they're very serious problems. One is that they're minimizing their own role in the murders. In other words, what's the Shoah? The Nazis came to our country, murdered our Jews, Nebuch. Tragedy. True. Kernel of truth. I mean, without the Nazis, it wouldn't have happened. But without the massive assistance of those local collaborators, it never would have reached the scope that it did. Okay? They also are promoting the false equivalency between communist and Nazi crimes. They're calling those crimes genocide. They're insisting that Nazi crimes are genocide, because if those communist crimes are genocide, that means that Jews committed genocide. If Jews committed genocide, how can you complain about our people committed genocide? They're also involved with, they have a problem of local heroes. They are glorifying people as national heroes who murdered Jews during the Shoah. In other words, the fact that they fought against the communists is a legitimate reason to turn them into heroes. But what happens if they murder their Jewish neighbors? That should disqualify them. And the last thing is, they're working to get the world to observe a joint Memorial Day for all the victims of communist, of totalitarian regimes, which would mean that you can do away with International Holocaust Day. And of course, that would also deflect attention from their crimes. So we're devoting a lot of attention to that.
What are you doing to change this narrative?
Well, first of all, I can give you one example. I can give you many examples, but just more recently in Kosovo, okay, in Mitrovica, which is the last place where Serbs are still living in Kosovo, the EU and the EU and the UN decided to renovate a home that belonged to one of the biggest Albanian Nazi collaborators. So we immediately wrote a letter to the Catherine Schönbrunn, the EU Commissioner in Fight Against Anti-Semitism, etc., and we identified this project as a very problematic project. Now, basically, it's a way to honor Jafar Deva, who was an Albanian who was involved in murdering Serbian partisans and also with Jews in Kosovo. And thank God it was stopped.
Thank you.
They dropped the project.
Thank you. Shimon Samuels, you work in Paris, but you have also been active in Latin America. So please, could you tell us briefly about both these projects or this kind of work?
Yes, I never dreamed that I would be doing what I do today, but I was born 2 weeks after VE Day in England. I was brought up in a small village in England with no knowledge of the Holocaust whatsoever. As a teenager, I started to read, and I read that the Nazis aimed to murder 33,000 Jews, and so I developed a great respect for water. 30 miles of the English Channel, which saved us from the Holocaust on the continent. It was a time when, for young Jews, the film was Exodus, and it turned us on going to Israel, which is where I went. I stayed there for university, where I met my Argentine wife, and that's when Latin America began for me. I was, for 3 years, working at the Israeli embassy in Mexico, responsible for PR. And this was the beginning of the dictatorships. And so, just as an example, I went with a prominent journalist from Israel in Buenos Aires. We went into the prison where the news editor of a well-known newspaper, Jacobo Timmerman, was in solitary. And as a result, this journalist, Eyal, he got Jacobo out of Israel, out of Argentina to Israel. So these things were, but it wasn't really a full-time job. In 1988, I was in London visiting my daughter, and I saw a newspaper which said in a big headline that excuse me, I'm getting a little bit emotional here. The Simon Wiesenthal Center was to present a list of Nazis to the Home Minister, and I think that Effie was in that. I telephoned a journalist friend, and I asked him where were these people staying, and I sat in the lobby. 3 rabbis came by, and I said, "Are you from the Wiesenthal Center?" They said, "Yes." So I said, "Look, I don't know you, you don't know me, but I do know Europe and Latin America, and I'd like to ask, what are you going to be doing?" And so they said, "Well, what do you think we should be doing?" And I said three things. Number one, I would like to open an office in Paris. Why Paris? Because it's the largest French and the largest Muslim and Jewish communities. And as we say at the Passover, the Lord took us out of Egypt with a clenched fist and an outstretched hand. we have a chance there perhaps to make something with the what today is called the Abraham accounts. Anyway, so accords. So and that's number two. The earth is shaking in Yugoslavia, and it's going to spread. And you don't have to get to the Richter scale 7 to see that this is going to result in anti-Bolshevik, anti-Semitic leadership. And the third was down the road from your hotel is you can buy Commodore 64. I don't think anybody remembers that except from our age, where you have these games for children, Türken Raus and Holocaust Manager, and it will go with the technology. And so they said this is very interesting, and particularly Rabbi Cooper, he said, well, why don't you come to Los Angeles? And I said, well, come to Los Angeles. Well, we'll can speak further, but you're going to have to stop in Vienna to convince Simon Wiesenthal. So I did. I came here, and I told Wiesenthal that I would like to open a European office in Paris. Nein, nein, nein. Ich bin der Europäische Büro. And so I said to Wiesenthal, you know, in every partnership there are usually sometimes at least 5% or 3% of differences. And I promise you that you will never say, why was I the last to know? Because I heard from somewhere that that's what he said. And he looked at me and he said, I give you 6 months. And I said, look, here, Herr Wiesenthal, I understand you are a philatelist. I also, you know, I do with stamps. And he opened a drawer of postcards. And he said, do you know of Katyn? So I said, Katyn, do you mean the massacre of the Polish officers? And yeah, who did it? So I said, the Germans. And he said, really? Look at these postcards. They had to write to their families before they got shot into the joint grave. What do you see? And I said, the Hitler stamp. And what else? Well, the franking was stamped USSR. So who did it? I said, the Russians. So he said, this is your first scoop. So I thought, you know, something fishy going on here. And I said to him, Herr Wiesenthal, you know, this scoop can only be made by a Wiesenthal. And he smiled and he said, I give you 12 months and call me every week. So that was the beginning.
Thank you very much. Brigitte BAILER, could you now briefly introduce the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute? Thank you.
Thank you. Are you hearing me? Okay, great. I want to keep my mask on. I think in preparing for tonight's discussion, I looked a little bit up all the material I had in the Documentation Archive Center. I had left there when retiring some years ago. I looked up all my old emails. As a good archivist, I don't delete any old emails. Therefore, I now want to tell you a little bit of the history of the Institute. The history dates back now more than 2 decades. It was around the year 2000 that various suggestions for the founding of an institution about Austrian history on one hand, and of a museum of tolerance, which was propagated by the Holocaust survivor Leon Sellmann, were in the public debate. Taking that occasion, and in this context, within the Jewish community in Vienna, the idea came up to create a center devoted to research on the Shoah. The most ardent promoter being then president of the Jewish community, Ariel Musikant. the aim of such a center should be, first of all, preserving the archive of Simon Wiesenthal and creating a comprehensive base for Holocaust research in combining the relevant archival material outside state and regional archives. That were Holocaust-related parts of the archive of the Jewish community in Vienna, the largest surviving archive of a European Jewish community, parts of them, large parts, being in Jerusalem, in the archive of the history of the Jewish people, and in microfilm in Vienna. Other parts had survived in former storage facilities of the Jewish community itself. You know, some people do something in boxes, and these boxes go to a storage facility and so on. Heart of the collection of the Research Institute should be, of course, Simon Wiesenthal's documents and correspondence. And back then it was thought it would be a good idea to add the collections of the Documentation Center of Austrian Resistance. The name of our institution is misleading in some way, because the Documentation Center had already done in the 1960s the first research on Holocaust victims in Austria. That was the first publication, came out in 1966, back then by the Jewish historian Johnny Moser. And in the 1990s, beginning in the second half of the 1990s, the Documentation Center started the research on the names of the Austrian victims of the Holocaust. Johnny Moser, back in the 60s, had done some mathematics, insurance mathematics, and came up with the number of at least 65,500 Austrian Jews who had been murdered in the Shoah. And in the work since the 1990s, my colleagues at the Documentation Center we have now almost 65,000 names and biographies of victims of the Holocaust, of Austrian victims of the Holocaust. And the estimate goes to at least 66,000. But I still think, you see, I like Johnny Moser. I think it's very, very impressive how he really correctly calculated the number of the victims. It was really great. And the results of this work can be seen not only on our website, doew.at, but as well in the database of Yad Vashem. In the database, you find at the Memorial of the Murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin. And the base of this, our work, was the base for the recently opened Wall of Names in Vienna. And I think I'm a little bit, I like the Documentation Center, the place of my work for more than 40 years. And the collection of the Documentation Archive should have gone to the Wiesenthal Center back then. That didn't happen because our steering committee and our board didn't want to give up the independence of the Documentation Center, but therefore our institution, just stayed as cooperating partner for the Institute, and the Institute itself now is member of the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute in the association. Participants in these discussions back then were, as I told you, the Jewish community and Ari Musikant, of course Simon Wiesenthal, the then academic director of the Documentation Center, Wolfgang Neugebauer, later on, from the very beginning assisting him. I was helping him from 2004 on. I was his successor, so I was the director of the Documentation Center. Then we worked with historians of the Institute of Contemporary History, University of Vienna, First of all, Bertrand Pertz, who still is member of the steering board, the director of the Jewish Museum in Vienna, and all these institutions later on became members of the Association of the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute. It has no personal members, they are institutional members. Later on, there were more institutions to come, like the Zentrum für Jüdische Kulturgeschichte, Center for Jewish Cultural History, University of Salzburg, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, represented by Juliane Wetzel of the Alliance's Academic Working Group, and Erinnern.at, an association for Holocaust education founded within the Federal Ministry of Education, Science and Research, how its name is right now. And I might add something to Efraim ZUROFF, the IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, has done last year a small, but I think comprehensive publication on Holocaust distortion, where you can find a lot of facts which we are told right now, a little bit of history of Holocaust distortion, and it is download for free on the IRA's website, holocaust-remembrance.org. The first concepts for the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute in 2002 were presented to policymakers in asking for the funding of the institute. Austria, there are a lot of rich people in Austria, but Austria hasn't a tradition of private funding of institutes. In Austria, it's the tradition to ask for public funding. And the city of Vienna, the then mayor of the city of Vienna, Michael Häupl, promised to help, but there were still discussions to be done with the Federal Republic. It is a tradition as well. It's in the documentation center the same. If the Republic pays half, the city pays the other half. So you come to a financial sum. This first concept had an introduction of Simon Wiesenthal himself, and I want to quote him. The initiative of the Jewish Community Organization to establish and organize a Shoah research center at the Rabensteig in Vienna, where we are here now, presented the ideal solution to my problem. As an honorary citizen of the city of Vienna, it is a matter of great importance to me to know that the results of my work over many decades are well preserved in the heart of the city. Therefore, I acquiesced to have the research center bear my name. So it was, I remember the discussions in the meeting room of the Jewish community around the corner. The legal founding of the association, des Vereins, was in 2004, but it took until 2008 for a final decision for financing by the city and the Republic of Austria. After some complicated internal conflicts and problems, the Vienna Wiesenthal Center, as we know it today, could be established since 2016 here in Rabensteig 3. The years before, since 2009, in a quite small flat in the Cedar Friedmanplatz, that's just around the corner here. There, the institute could just uphold a very reduced functioning because of the lack of space. Today, the institute is an internationally well-known research institution. Its fellows not only give important input, present their findings to the public, start raising the awareness of the Wiesenthal Institute, and finally, these fellows present connection points to the academic public internationally in many, many countries of the world. The Institute until now withstands political involvement and therefore is able to preserve its image as a solely academic institution. Sometimes there are discussions coming up if it shouldn't deal with right-wing extremism and anti-Semitism as well. I don't withhold my personal point of view. There are other institutions doing just like that, like the Institute for Research of Conflicts, the IFK, and foremost my own institution, not own, but the Documentation Center of Austrian Resistance, where as a research institution, just focusing on the history of the Shoah can be singled out and has a single position within the academic landscape of Austria. The details of the Institute works can be seen on its website, which offers a lot of interesting information, and on the Institute, on its archive, its research, and its very successful cooperation with internationally renowned institutions. In getting older, I now function as a sort of witness of the history of the Institute. Strange feeling, but nevertheless. The involvement in the founding and further development of the Institute was rewarding, sometimes tiring, raising sometimes a lot of stress, especially in times of conflict. But I am proud that we were able to help establish such a successful institution like it is today. Thank you.
Thank you. Two of you already mentioned encounters with Simon Wiesenthal, and as we are here to speak about the legacy of Simon Wiesenthal, I wanted to ask you what connected you personally with Simon Wiesenthal and what connected Wiesenthal with the institution you represent. And I would like Mr. Samuels to start with this question. Thank you.
Well, I think that I've more or less covered that question. I would like to...
How did it go on after the 12 months were over?
Well, seeing that it was close to 20 years of coming to this city, and it still goes on even without him. But what I'd like to do is to just give you an example of one of the things which I consider very important and very germane to our program here. On the 2nd of February 1992, President Menem of Argentina, he proclaimed the opening of the Nazi files. And Rabbi Hayer, who is the leader of the Wiesenthal Center, called me, "Get down to Argentina." I was taken into the bowels of the Casa Rosada, and there were on the table 7 folders, 2 of them named Mengele, and 2 of the files, one for Mengele that we were looking for, and the other a poor Jew who had the name Mengele and who was being abused by the police. And then Bormann, Rauf, and most of the work was of newspaper clippings. So I emerged from the Casa Rosada to the journalists. I mean, there was a huge number of journalists. And I said, I demand the missing 8th file of Mengele, which the pages 22 to 24 are missing. And also the 8th file, don't say that there isn't a file on Eichmann. So my police guardian at the hotel, 2 days later I was sitting having breakfast, and he said that, look, there's a man at the entrance who wishes to talk to you. He was a drab little man, and he was carrying a brown envelope. And he said, you asked on television for the missing pages, and here they are, $2,000. So he was detained on his way out, and his materials were false. The foreign minister, Guido de Tella, took me on a tour of the archives. And he says, look, we have damp, we have rats, we have thefts, but we're trying out our best. Back at the hotel, I was about to leave, and I had a little note in the box where you put the keys to the room, which I haven't seen since then and until in the hotel where we are now. And it said, you will be leaving. I'm staying here, and I'm interested in the Shoah. Give me 10 minutes. And so I called, and this young man, he was amazing, and he stayed with us for 13 years, Sergio. And 6 months later, he had set up the Latin American office. Not only that, we had something which was an exhibition called what was it called?
Courage to Remember.
Courage to Remember, exactly. And he was going to have this in the Recoleta, those who know Buenos Aires, a very important place. We also had a film with Orson Welles and Elizabeth Taylor called Genocide, which had won the Oscar, and he was going to be showing that. And Menem was supposed to have come. And his guards came down in the hall and said to me, he's not going to be coming. I said, why not? He said, because there are madres. There are mothers. And I said, madres? Yes, they disappeared. And so I said, look, give me 5 minutes. And I went to the madres who were wearing the particular scarf. And I said to them, what is your plan here? And they said, we want to boo our president. And I said, look, this will be really a loss. Do you know anything about the Holocaust? And one of them said, I was in a camp, and I made my way to Argentina. So I said, so who better than you know that this is a great loss? And so she said, give me 2 minutes. And she spoke with her colleagues, and she said, we make a promise. We will not do anything that was going to upset it. So I said, great. And I went running up to the guard, and he said, it's too late. And I noticed that when the president was coming, they had an ambulance, and the ambulance had gone. So the following day, he ended up in hospital with a thrombosis. And I think that this was the revenge of the mothers. So, so back at the, he had opened this office for us. And 2 months later, of course, came the bombing of the Israeli embassy. And after that, the Amia bombing with 85 deaths and over 300 losses. Wounded. And that sort of took the place of everything else. And so you were talking about SEANA. And SEANA was the Commission for the Clarification of Nazi Activities in Argentina. I was supposed to be on that, but I felt very bad because Menem had lost interest. And the last part, I think that I would talk about after your next move is the Pripke case. And the Pripke case was the proof that Menem had lost interest.
Thank you. Mr. ZUROFF, you are still trying to track down the last living Nazis. You spoke about 2 trials in Germany still going on beforehand. Recently, however, we have seen that even if there is such a trial, these people are old and frail. And the question is, how useful are such trials today? Why is it still important to have them?
Okay, there are a lot of people who were skeptical about the trials of people in their 90s, or in another case, someone 101. But the truth of the matter is that it still sends a very powerful reminder of the crimes. Quite a few of these people served in camps that are not that well known outside Germany, Stutthof, Sachsenhausen. And we're lucky because we had the media, the world media has given this a lot of attention and has brought the message to the entire world in a certain sense. In other words, if you commit crimes like this, even 8 decades later, or almost 8 decades later, you can still be punished. And the testimonies of the survivors are very vivid, even to this day, very graphic, and they really send a message. So every time I've been there, I've been, you know, quite a few times to the trials themselves. Very good coverage by the media, both primarily from Germany, but not only from Germany. And it serves a purpose. In other words, even slightly flawed justice is better than no justice. Now, I just want to add one other thing. One of the amazing products of these type of trials has been a verdict that was rendered in the case of a guard in the Stutthof concentration camp who arrived in the camp at the age 17, and he was in a watchtower and apparently did not personally murder anybody. The judge, Anne Meyer Goring, wrote what I think is one of the most brilliant verdicts in a case of this sort. She absolutely tore to pieces all the arguments against the trials. The passage of time, the age of the defendant, the fact that he was only a lower-ranking guard. This explained very well how there's no such thing as a small cog. And this is something that I hope will be taught in every school in the world this year. So every year we publish a report on investigation and prosecution of Nazi war criminals all over the world. And in our last report, we published her verdict verbatim in order to bring it to the attention of as many people as possible.
Thank you. Question for you. Even on the victim side, there are only a few survivors left who can tell about the Nazi crimes. How will that change the way contemporary history deals with the Nazi era?
I think these are different things. Contemporary history as a science, academic profession, deals with documents, deals with a lot of evidence on contemporary history. The narratives of the survivors are of great importance, a very interesting additional material, but it's not the entire material we have got. It's just an addition because with all respect to these people, and I had the honor and I still very much appreciate that I knew a lot of these survivors, especially those working in the documentation center, but Simon Wiesenthal himself. Memory is not always fact-oriented. We all know that. If you have any event you share with your partner or with a friend, and some years later you say, you remember loud? No, that was not quite different. So I think we have to take into account that the memory is very, very important. It's important to make people see, to make especially young people feel what it was like to be persecuted. But it's no source for facts. Mm-hmm. It's a source for emotion. It's a very, very important source of emotion. I think the story of a survivor can help young people understand a lot more as if they are reading a book I have written, or a colleague has written, or a story I can tell them, because it's a very immediate, you know how people lived through that. And there are a lot of efforts right now all over the world to preserve that memory. There are a lot of video archives, start with the most prominent, the Spielberg archive, but there are a lot of archives more. Today I mentioned Erinnern.at. Erinnern.at uses videos of survivors as a very, very good tool for education and information of young people. So I think we have to find ways to make people see that or feel the immediate emotion of the survivor, even, and modern technology makes it possible, even after that these people have died. there is even I very much doubt it, there are even efforts to make them holograms. And I've seen such a thing in an IRA plenary, and I don't feel really good about that. It's a little bit like Raumschiff Enterprise. But I think a video, see people or even hear people telling their story. We have in the documentation center 8 interviews, only spoken interviews. Video was too expensive back then, with more than 800 people who survived National Socialism. Even that could be used. So I think we just have to use the technology. And then this will help us to live without the witnesses of the time.
But their part is more for raising awareness and not as a source for historians. Thank you. Mr. Samuels, in what direction will the work of the Wiesenthal centers evolve when there are no more Nazis to hunt? So what's your work will be in the future?
I think that there will always be a Nazi. But I would like to just speak about defer to Effie, because he knows much better than I do. But because this was South America, the Pripke issue was very important, and I'd like just to say a few words. There was a journalist who infiltrated the young neo-Nazis in Germany, and he created a situation where he came to us, and I was very doubtful, but what he wanted to do was to build up a whole program that would shake Germany. And part of what this sting included was that he and one other of our colleagues was to go down to Bariloche to meet with somebody who was called Juan Mahler. Now, the name did appear today. They went down to Bariloche, and they had a wild time there because Juan Mahler, he said, look, I was in the Abwehr, and my name was Reinhold Kops, and they said, aren't you scared of being found out? And he said, I'm only scared of the old man in Vienna. Anyway, to cut it short, there was this thing worked, and then there was a press conference, and then after the press conference, it was one of our other colleagues had been in Kew Gardens in London at the British records, and what happened with our colleagues in Bariloche was put on public news. And so we got a phone call from ABC television correspondent Sam Donaldson that he wanted to go down to Bariloche and he wanted to follow up. And I still have this huge canister of film. He comes and Kops, as his real name. He had a hotel which was called La Campagna. And so Donaldson goes up to him and says, Mr. Kops, and he says, no, my name is Mahler. Yes, but you told the Wiesenthal Center that your name was Kops. And he said, well, now it's Mahler. So Donaldson said, so are you a war criminal? And he said, no, not at all. You want a war criminal? I mean, this is not, word for word. He said, you see that white car over there? That is Erich Pripke. If you want a war criminal, that's him. Wiesenthal used to say that his happiest moment was when he would hear that one Nazi was was threatening to go to Wiesenthal to the other Nazi. So it was March 1994, and when he came, and I've still got the film. The film is still turning. And he goes up to the white Pontiac and he says, "Are you Mr. Pripke?" And he said, "Yes." "Are you the Mr. Pripke who was in Rome during the war?" "Yes." "And you killed people?" He said, "Only 2. And he said, "So you're a war criminal?" He said, "And you, sir, are not a gentleman." And he went on. This then came to us, and with our colleague Rabbi Cooper, he and I flew to Rome to request from the Italian Prime Minister at the time, Silvio Berlusconi, an extradition order for Pripke. And this was for his role in the Ardeatine Caves massacre. In March 1944, the Italian resistance set a trap in the center of Rome for a brigade of German ethnic military police from the Italian south of the Tyrol region. The partisans had killed 33. That same evening, I don't know if that's true, but this is what I read, Hitler demanded the execution of 10 Italians for every German killed, to take place within the next 24 hours. The victims of the reprisal, which took place in the caves, included residents of the Via Rasella, which was where the site of the bombing, anti-fascist prisoners, and 75 Jews captured and taken from the ghetto. From the Kew Gardens Public Record Office in London, we had 2 key documents. One was signed by Kappler, and the other claiming Pripke selected the 330 people to be killed. This was signed by Pripke, stating that he had personally shot 2 of those on the list. Berlusconi slapped the table and said, "I wanted this man on trial in Roma." And he sent us to the Justice Ministry cigar-chomping official Liliana Ferraro. The following week, she was coming to Paris, and we organized a dinner for her in our home. We invited an Argentine diplomat, a prosecutor in the Klaus Barbie trial, and the Herald Tribune, now the New York Times International correspondent, to write the extradition order. Ferraro warned that as Pripke had fled from a British military prison, Rome would hold a military trial, and people around the table were not happy. So here we see what I was saying before. Menem felt critique was enough about the documents that were not really documents. And he therefore, he was not interested in extraditing Pripke. So we brought to Argentina several members of the Ardeatine martyrs' families who made a major media impact. It took several months, but in August 1995, Pripke arrived on Roman soil. Every month, I was to sit in the military court. The concierge in my hotel told me my grandfather was a victim of Pripke. The Italian public opinion was with us. He was first acquitted in August 1996 for simply following orders. The grief-stricken martyrs' families occupied the court as a sign of protest. It was after midnight when I got a call from the then Foreign Minister Lamberto Dini. He was the Prodi government, it wasn't the government before, with a request to come to the ministry now, at midnight. He was seated with a Justice Ministry official, and this is how the argument went. "What will it take you to clear the court?" I said, "I can't clear the court. It's the martyrs." "Okay, only the martyrs. Fine, we understand. So what will work for them?" "A new trial." "Okay, you have it." I said, "What? Wait a minute. We must have grounds for that. There were journalists who were waiting." And he said, "Okay, How many Italians did they kill for each German soldier? 10. Yes, but how many did they kill? 335. And the official with a smile said, the 5 too many. That means he was not simply following orders. Brilliant. Why was the martyr's occupation of the court so necessary? We feared that an exonerated Pripke would be driven the 6 kilometers to the Vatican to demand sanctuary. He had had contacts in the Curias himself, but above all, we did not wish to bring embarrassment to Pope John Paul II. Pripke, after appeals, was condemned to life imprisonment. Due to his age, he was allowed house arrest in a flat owned by his lawyer. He tried to get out several times. He wanted to work in a hospital. Each time the Wiesenthal Center came in, he died at the age of just over 100. And I think that this is a prime example of one of Wiesenthal's aphorisms, and that is that age is not a cause for impunity. And Pripke, in fact, had outlived the families of the martyrs. So that's hardly justice.
Thank you. So we heard about Pripke right now, and I want to hand you over the question I asked Shimon beforehand. What will be the task of the Wiesenthal Center after?
First of all, I explained already what the task of the Wiesenthal Center is. So besides fighting against Holocaust distortion, we're also fighting against anti-Semitism. But I want to say a few words about Mr. Wiesenthal himself, which I think is important. As you can imagine, the task that we have is a very frustrating task. We're working against the clock. Very often, suspects die in the middle of investigations. They die before going to trial. And sometimes even Nazis are acquitted, as in the Capiro case in Hungary. So it's a very frustrating job. But one of the things that gives us the determination, or helps us to maintain our determination to continue to do as much as we can to maximize justice, is a story that Mr. Wiesenthal told. And I'll be honest with you, I had never read his books before I started working for the Wiesenthal Center. Never was interested in prosecution of Nazis, but when I met him, that already sort of educated me, and his persistence and his perseverance and his dedication is something that really inspired me. And the story that he tells is I'm sure many of you have heard it already, but I think it has to be said again. Simon Wiesenthal was asked many times, why didn't he return to his position, to his occupation as an architect? He was actually a very talented artist, very successful architect, but instead of returning to his job, he dedicated his life to trying to facilitate justice. So he said the following: listen, I'm not a religious Jew, I'm not observant, but I believe in the world to come. And in the world to come, the survivors, when the survivors pass away, they'll meet the victims. And the first question that the victims will ask the survivors will be, "No, what did you do with your lives? You were the lucky ones." So there's a couple different versions to his answer. One of the versions is, well, one will say I was a lawyer, another one will say I smuggled American cigarettes, and I will say I didn't forget you. And I've never forgotten that, and that's something that really continues to inspire me.
Thank you. This was a very nice memory, yeah, indeed. I would like to thank you for your contributions now and turn over to the audience. Are there any questions in the audience you would like to ask our experts here? Yes, please, Evelyn.
I would like to ask Mr. Samuels, when will the Museum of Tolerance in Jerusalem will be opened officially?
Sorry?
Not Mr. Samuels, he has nothing to do with it. And I have news for you, I have nothing to do with it. So you're asking the wrong people. We don't know when the Museum of Tolerance will be opened in Jerusalem.
I have nothing to do with it.
Any other questions? Anyone?
What happened with the museum? Don't you want to tell us the story? What happened with the museum? No.
It's not a very happy story in the meantime. If it'll be open, then maybe it'll be a happy story.
Okay. If there is no question from the audience, I do have one. You talked about anti-Semitism, and that's a wide field to work on. Simon Wiesenthal wanted to show what happened. He wanted justice, but he also wanted to have awareness what happened, and in order to prevent that something like that happens ever again. Worldwide, however, we are again confronted with rising anti-Semitism, and the Corona crisis in particular just showed us in a crisis people are looking for scapegoats, and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories are spreading, not only in the net, also in newspapers, in some kind of newspapers and TV spots, YouTube, etc. Where are the limits of educational work, and what would Simon Wiesenthal say today about these developments? I think you knew him very well, so perhaps you could tell us.
Listen, I think he would say that obviously he'd be very disturbed by the rise of anti-Semitic incidents, and he would emphasize the importance of education, but not only education. First of all, legislation in the countries that would make these crimes punishable, and the question of the leadership, of the political leadership in these countries, who have to come out and make these things very clearly unacceptable, and that combined with education is part of the problem. To be perfectly honest, if anyone here thinks that anti-Semitism will ever disappear, I hate to disappoint you, but it's not going to happen. The idea is to keep it in as minimal a situation as possible. And just imagine what would have happened had all these wonderful efforts that are being done by people all over the world in the last 60, 70 years had not been done. We'd be in 100 times worse situation. And I want to tell you another thing. I'm sure many of you are aware of the accusations that have been hurled between the Ukrainians and the Russians. Many of them include Holocaust imagery, Holocaust terminology. And it's all bull. In other words, Putin isn't Hitler, the Russians are not committing genocide, and I can go on and on and on. But there is a slight silver lining, and I know it won't comfort many of you, but it's important to understand this. We have reached a situation where we have succeeded in convincing the world that the Holocaust is the most terrible tragedy in the annals of mankind. That was one of our goals, and we've succeeded. But now we have to continue and spread the word and convince the people that the only way to live in harmony will be if this hatred ends.
I think what you said about Simon Wiesenthal, that's exactly how I came to know him, because we tried, the beginning was in the 1980s when Holocaust denial began to pose a real big problem in Austria. Neo-Nazis went to schools, distributed leaflets, invented fake documents, which really made teachers especially uncertain. And that was back then when the Documentation Center and Simon Wiesenthal together, in cooperation with the then Ministry of Education, produced the first ever publication against Holocaust denial being spread to schools, being spread to teachers. That was very, very important to Wiesenthal. This first publication was followed by two more. The second was then with experts and historians from Austria and Germany as well. We tried to give the facts about as many topics of Holocaust denial and Holocaust distortion were on the table back then. And I think that, and the next step was, because you said legal actions, we in Austria, we have a law prohibiting National Socialist activities. And that law proved to be insufficient in bringing Holocaust deniers to court because it was too generally formulated. And then it was a documentation center in cooperation with Simon Wiesenthal, the Union of Jewish Students and other experts, who started an initiative for amending that law. And when later on there was a big hearing of experts in the National Council in Vienna, it was again Wiesenthal, a lot of others, myself as well, who gave more pressure to the question of amendment, and we succeeded. In 1992, the law was amended, and it is a really story of success because you can't cope with Holocaust denial in the internet, but there are no Austrian publications anymore. And many, many people and neo-Nazis have been tried according to that law, so I think it's a very important law. And that's exactly what you said. That was the aim of Simon Wiesenthal, to give education and to give the legal support. And according to my own experience, I think we will fail. If someone is a real anti-Semite, I'm afraid you can't convince him. But we can convince people not listening to him. We can convince people that his arguments are not true, are fake, are wrong, are not to be listened to. And we can just speak up whenever it's necessary, all of us. And I think that would be the legacy, for me, that's part of the legacy of Simon Wiesenthal.
Thank you.
Listen, one thing I want to emphasize. You have to remember that Simon Wiesenthal was one of the few people who in the 50s, the 60s, not so much in the 50s, in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, when the Holocaust was not, you'll excuse me, a popular topic, he was the one who was carrying the torch. And if you ask me, I'm convinced that the thing that worried Simon Wiesenthal the most was not that he didn't catch Nazi X or Y, but rather that the Holocaust would be forgotten. And I think we're in a position now to say that they'll never happen. In the meantime, it'll never happen.
Thank you. Mr. Samuels, you wanted to
Yes, just 3 points. I would see anti-Semitism like a drop of mercury on your hand. When it's cool, it's flat. When it heats up, as we saw mercury in the mouth during the past couple of years, then it builds up, and it can go in any direction. But what I'd like to say is that what fascinated me was that the Austrian government, on the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, they brought in Wiesenthal as a member of the diplomatic group to represent them. And he focused at that UN meeting on Bosnia and on Rwanda. And I see that, yes, the Holocaust is unique, but the Holocaust, I think, also has to be taken within the whole issue of genocide. It can harm us from some points of view, but our friends will understand. And I was in Halabja, in Kurdistan, on the 20th anniversary of Saddam Hussein's gassing of the Kurds. Wherever there's gassing, I think that we understand what that means. And as I was speaking to the people there who, at the time of the gassing, where you had something like a horrendous figure died on the spot, and then there were those who have suffered for years with the eyes, with the lungs, and I was with a lawyer who was trying to get hospitals to deal with these people. And he did. He took many of them to Jefferson Hospital in Philadelphia. And so I stood there and I said, look, this is not my first time here. It's my second time. I was here 2,000 years ago. And as we look across the other side of the water to Iran, which has a genocidal intent, we wrote this book. And the book was the Talmud, which says, if not for myself, who will be? But if only for myself, what am I? And we are here for you, and I hope that you will be here for us. And I didn't know, but this was on television and went around, I think, all of Kurdistan. And I think that it would be a wonderful, possibility for the Wiesenthal Institute here to join us, because we're planning anyway to have such a meeting on the Holocaust as a key, or whatever you want to call it, to contemporary genocide.
Thank you. We have a question in the back right now, if you could.
Quick questions, so do you need the microphone? I just have to look at my mobile because. Could you please give us maybe some ideas about your last intervention in Austrian? It's not history; it's political circumstances everywhere. You intervened, or there was something about Stefan Tauschitz, and I'm sorry that I had my mobile with me, but I forgot his name because we should all forget his name. He was the head of Carinthian Office for the Protection of the Constitution, and as I think a few weeks ago, we could read a statement of yours in now in newspapers. And
their standards, right?
Yeah, right.
Correct.
And I would love you to give us an idea about how did the news reach you, and what do you think about your intervention?
So I was very lucky because I was interviewed by Der Standard, and they told me that the official in charge of defense of the Constitution and something, it's the title. It's a long title. In other words, basically anything against
Constitutional enemies and terrorists.
and terror. In other words, constitution and terror. In other words, against anti-Semitism, against fascism, against all these things. That the person who was just appointed in Carinthia to fill that post had 3 times participated in a meeting of Waffen-SS veterans and all sorts of right-wing types, and had once even spoken at the event. So I said, this is absolutely crazy. It's mad. So the next day, the headline in the Standard was "Skandal in Israel." Okay, and ultimately he was removed, but he wasn't fired. He was removed to another post. But at least we got him out of there. Now listen, there's no question that the media are a powerful tool, and you have to know how to use the media. Simon was very good at it, and we're in his footsteps, and we try to do what we can do.
You spoke about the Holocaust and Holocaust denial beforehand, and
Distortion, not denial.
Distortion, but that nobody can deny it today anymore. This was also part of Wiesenthal's legacy. Everybody knows about it, and you can't deny it. We have now the situation, you know, all these demonstrations and manifestations against the measures, corona, to prevent corona. And there you have this strange happening that people are making strange moves, like putting on the stars.
The stars of David.
Yeah. So how do you comment on this, and how can legislation react on this?
Okay, so first of all, this is obviously very unfortunate. But again, that is a question that relates to leadership. In other words, if the political and religious leadership of Austria or of any country will speak out very clearly, unequivocally, and not worry about the issue of freedom of speech, because they could say it's an issue of freedom of speech. We have a right to say anything. We could say the most stupidest thing possible. But the issue is, freedom of speech is not the right to say anything that will harm people, ultimately have very, very serious results. That's the difference. So everyone is welcome to their opinion, as long as that opinion doesn't endanger the lives of anyone else. So this is the question for leadership. They're the ones who have to come across with this, and not only the political leadership, but the intellectual leadership and the religious leadership of a country have to address that issue, for example.
If I may add something, there was a quite recent case of trial against someone wearing the Star of David with not vaccinated, and he was charged.
Okay, good.
So I think there is something especially aware. There is some awareness in the justice systems in the meantime, and I think that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Are there any more questions from the audience? No? Then I thank you all for coming, and I wish you a nice evening. And yes, we'll all think of Simon Wiesenthal one day or the other. Thank you.